It's a game.
Well, all of the actors in Playtime are people that I know. So they're based on interviews with people who I personally have befriended, who, for example, the Dubai story originates from my own housekeeper who basically, well, she escaped her Dubai employers when she came to London and walked the streets of London, and basically from there began to kind of build her new life in London. And so that story is quite a personal story, and so is the Icelandic story set in Reykjavik, which is a portrait of a friend of mine who lost his house and his family, and his house is now a modern ruin, which appears in the film. And he basically got to terms with really the Icelandic crash when it happened, the financial crash, which really took away everything that he owned, and now basically lives in a caravan and is basically be rid of all material possessions and works as an artist and a photographer traveling around. And so that's a true story. And the gallery character is based on gallerists that I know, played by James Franco, who's also an artist and makes video art, as well as appears in many well-known Hollywood films. But he has a personal relationship to what he is discussing in the work. And Maggie Cheung, I had worked with her in 10,000 Ways, plays an interviewer who is very interested in contemporary art and herself is in a career change between being one of Asia's most important actors and now is an artist and has in a way left filmmaking or left being in front of the camera to return to being behind the camera and making her own films and her own artworks. And Simone Puri, who appears in the work as an auctioneer, is an auctioneer of contemporary art in real life, one of the world's most famous auctioneers. So all of the characters really are based on people that I know, and we visit these capital cities, Dubai, which is the new capital for wealth in the world, as everyone knows, London, an old capital for wealth in the world, everyone knows that, and Iceland, Reykjavik, a city that not everybody knows, but certainly is a very interesting city because literally the volcanic landscape of Iceland is itself something which is always in transformation, and that transformation, the physicality of the landscape, permeates the actual trauma that the character himself experiences in our portrait of this capital city of Reykjavik.
And would you say the art market is stronger than ever?
No regrets. It's yours, madam. For $120 million. Sold.
I love Youngblood.
Well, I think in Playtime, it's a work which is very much based on my emotional relationship to how I feel about the current state of the influence of capital in contemporary art. And it's something of a quandary for myself because I can't make my works without someone investing certain amounts of capital in it. And so for me, the irony is not lost in relationship between my experience of making artworks which demand a certain amount of capital and the presentation of those works. So I'm someone who's very dependent on capital to make my works, unlike a sort of artist that might be a painter. or a sort of artist that makes drawings. So I think that's always something that I'm always very much sort of aware of in my kind of presence has a kind of ambivalent relationship to the art world that I'm inscribed in to exist.
I think that's a really interesting point to talk about the aesthetic as well, because I mean it's a huge installation. I know it was originally 7. Seven,
Yeah.
good, sorry. So I know it was originally 7 channels, but even in this magnificent kind of installation, it is very luxurious and it's very seductive and it feels very kind of, it plays on traditions of historical paintings and things like that. Are you using this language of the upper class or of the elite kind of visual art to talk about it, or is that just kind of what you're drawn to?
Well, I think in all my works, I'm very much interested in the use of cinematic devices to tell my stories. And in this work, a little bit similar to 10,000 Ways, which was shown at the City Biennial 2010, is a work which is very much about trying to use aesthetics and to use the vocabulary of contemporary art and installation. You could say something similar to maybe perhaps how history painting might have been used at one particular moment in time in the history of art. There's a way in which I like to a certain extent, utilize techniques which are just involved in the deep traditions of the moving image culture. And so I'm not really a video artist who is making work that is somewhat ambivalent about the sort of history of moving image. All of those aesthetic preoccupations are part of the language of the work that I make. And so there's a certain seduction that I'm interested in playing audiences towards dealing with questions that they might not otherwise want to be so involved in. And so that's part of my lure, if you like, my aesthetical lure in terms of trying to, in a way, make audiences confront questions which might be difficult for them to really look at. So there's a certain looking into the mirror in this work. So that's something which I've been involved in for quite a long time. I think when I'm thinking about the idea of looking into the mirror, that I'm making a work which is both about the art world, but I'm situated in the art world myself. And so there's this kind of mirror effect, I think, in the work. And when we go into a gallery, we're not going into a space which looks necessarily untidy. It's a well-organized aesthetic experience. And so, in a way, I think I'm bringing both those things to bear in my works in terms of how they're constructed, but also in terms of content. There's this sort of looking into the mirror in terms of the themes that it's looking at, auctions, the way that sort of art has become commoditized, the way that we view kind of contemporary art as opposed to its functionality. I think when James Franco says things like, well, maybe one day video art might be a work that people might want to invest in the auction process, I think he's saying it very ironically. So I think there are all of these aspects which I'm utilizing in the work to make a comment about the situation that I find myself in.
And obviously there's the revealing of how the film is being made at points. The film crew comes in and you see the armature of the story itself. Maybe just to finish off, to touch on the documentary aspect, which also is put next to the main Playtime.
Yes, because Capital is a kind of sister project to Playtime, and in that piece it's a conversation that took place at the Hayward Gallery. I was invited by the Hayward Gallery in 2012 to participate in a project called Wide Open School, and this was a project where basically artists were kind of given the gallery as a space to create a performance or to create anything that they would like. And what I did was to invite David Harvey, the author of a book called Enigma of Capital, to explain and in a way, discuss quite complicated ideas in a way quite an accessible language, someone that David Harvey is phenomenally good at doing, to explain capital and really what is capital today. And he's really very riveting. And also I invited different people like the late Stuart Hall to also participate in the conversation, who completely disagrees with Harvey's analysis. And several other people add their voices to what is a conversation that we've all been involved in, I think, over the last couple of years, since the crash of 2008, about the role of capital in our lives, and why is it, as an art form or as a process, so hard to depict in visual arts. So that's another question that I was also looking at in the work and the discussion, which takes place in this 2-screen piece. So anyone who wants to understand about how capital is working these days, I would definitely advise them to look at that work. It's really quite phenomenally kind of informative.
Is this a work which you could have made 15 years ago, or do we need to have had the financial crisis for it to? I mean, obviously Reykjavik. Is there something particularly relevant now?
Well, I think there is something that's particularly relevant about making this work now, because it's a conversation that everybody's been having. It's an everyday conversation, and I think there's a way in which it's quite ironic that in an art context, there are very few artists these days who are prepared to participate in that conversation in the actual making of the work itself. And so it just felt, to my mind, it was important to make a work that reflected on the contemporary condition that I inhabit and others inhabit. So that's one of the reasons why I made the work.
It's a game. Good?